The coffee cup slipped from Eleanor's trembling fingers, ceramic fragments scattering across the worn linoleum floor of La Mesa Locale. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the mysterious woman at table 7 turned toward her, eyes flashing with something that made Eleanor's blood sing in recognition. The words that had just escaped her lips hung in the air like incense, ancient syllables she had never learned yet somehow knew, flowing from her tongue as naturally as her own name. The woman rose with fluid grace, her midnight hair catching the dim restaurant light. Eleanor's knees threatened to buckle as those piercing dark eyes fixed on her, studying her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle. She pressed her palm against her throat, feeling the rapid pulse there, wondering why her body responded to this stranger's presence like a tuning fork struck against stone. "Perdón, señora," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible above the evening clatter of dishes and conversation. But the apology felt wrong on her tongue, hollow compared to those other words that had risen unbidden from somewhere deep inside her chest. She knelt to gather the broken porcelain, her hands shaking as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The woman stepped closer, her heels clicking against the floor with deliberate precision. Eleanor could smell jasmine and something else. Something that reminded her of her grandmother's old jewelry box, metallic and mysterious. When she dared to look up, the woman's expression had softened into something resembling wonder. "Where did you learn those words, child?" The question came in perfect Spanish, but underneath it Eleanor heard an accent she couldn't place, something that seemed to echo from centuries past. Eleanor's throat constricted. She had no answer because she didn't understand it herself. The words had simply emerged when she saw this woman, as if her body recognized something her mind couldn't grasp. She stood slowly, fragments of ceramic falling from her apron, and shook her head. "I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't know why I said that." But the woman wasn't looking at her anymore. Her gaze had shifted to something behind Eleanor, and when she turned, she saw Señor Martinez approaching with that concerned expression he wore whenever customers complained. Eleanor's stomach dropped. She couldn't afford to lose this job, not when her rent was already 2 weeks overdue. "Is everything all right here?" Señor Martinez's voice carried the weight of a man who had dealt with difficult customers before, but there was something else in his tone, a wariness that Eleanor had never heard. The woman's lips curved into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Everything is perfect. In fact, I believe I've found exactly what I was looking for." She reached into her purse and placed a generous tip on the table. Bills that Eleanor recognized were far more than the cost of her untouched meal. "Tell me, does she have family? Grandparents, perhaps?" Eleanor's blood chilled. Why would a stranger ask about her family? She took an unconscious step backward, bumping into a chair. "I should get back to work," she mumbled, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. "Her grandmother passed 5 years ago," Señor Martinez said, and Eleanor wanted to disappear into the cracked tiles beneath her feet. Why was he sharing her personal information with this woman? "Eleanor is a good girl, works hard. Is there a problem?" The woman studied Eleanor with renewed interest, her dark eyes seeming to catalog every detail of her face. "No problem at all. Quite the opposite." She stood and moved toward the door, then paused. "Eleanor, isn't it? Tell me, do you ever dream of places you've never been? Old houses with high ceilings and rooms that smell of roses?" Eleanor's hand flew to the small locket at her throat, the one her grandmother had left her, warm against her skin. She had dreamed of such places, rooms filled with candlelight and the rustle of silk, but she had never told anyone. How could this stranger possibly know? The woman smiled, a genuine expression this time, and something in Eleanor's chest loosened like a knot finally coming undone. "My name is Isabella Drakon. When you're ready for answers, come to the old church on Calle de la Luz. Ask for the Shadow Estate." She paused at the threshold, her silhouette framed by the neon glow of the street beyond. "Your grandmother would be proud of who you're becoming." The door closed behind her with a soft chime, leaving Eleanor standing among the scattered ceramic pieces, her heart racing and her mind spinning with questions she didn't know how to ask. Senor Martinez was saying something about cleaning up the mess, but his voice seemed to come from very far away. That night, Eleanor sat on her narrow bed in the tiny apartment she shared with two other girls, turning her grandmother's locket over in her hands. She had worn it every day since the funeral, but now she really looked at it for the first time. The silver was tarnished with age, but she could make out an intricate pattern etched into its surface, symbols that seemed to shift in the lamplight. Her fingers found the tiny clasp and the locket opened with a soft click. Inside, nestled against faded velvet, was a photograph she had never seen before. Two figures stood in front of an imposing mansion, her grandmother as a young woman beside a man with pale skin and striking features. On the back, in her grandmother's careful handwriting, Grace Rivera and William Drakon, 1952. Eleanor's breath caught. Drakon. The same surname as the mysterious woman from the restaurant. She studied the photograph more closely, noting how her grandmother's hand rested confidently on the man's arm, how they both gazed directly at the camera with an air of belonging that Eleanor had never seen in any other pictures of her family. She opened her laptop and typed Shadow Estate, Mexico City into the search engine, her pulse quickening as a single result appeared. An address on Calle de la Luz, just as Isabella had said, with a description that made Eleanor's hands tremble. Historic mansion, private residence, architectural significance dating to colonial period. The photograph slipped from her fingers onto the threadbare quilt. Grace Rivera. Her grandmother had never mentioned that surname, had always insisted their family name was simply Morales. But here was proof of something else. Something hidden. Eleanor picked up the photograph again, studying her grandmother's face, seeing for the first time a resemblance that went beyond features to something deeper, a quality of presence that Eleanor had always felt but never understood. Her phone buzzed with a text from her roommate asking if she could cover rent this month, and reality crashed back around her. She was Eleanor Morales, a waitress who could barely afford groceries, not someone connected to mysterious mansions and people with names like Drakon. But the words she had spoken to Isabella echoed in her memory, syllables that felt more true than any Spanish or English she had ever learned. She closed the locket and held it against her chest, feeling her heartbeat steady against the warm metal. Tomorrow she would go to work, serve coffee and take orders, pretend that nothing had changed. But even as she made this decision, she knew she was lying to herself. The woman named Isabella had awakened something that had been sleeping inside her, something that connected her to her grandmother's hidden past and to questions that demanded answers. The city lights filtered through her thin curtains, casting shadows that seemed to dance with possibilities. Eleanor pulled her blanket up to her chin and closed her eyes, but sleep eluded her. Instead, she found herself remembering dreams she had pushed aside, visions of grand staircases and rooms where candlelight flickered against dark wood. Places where she moved with a confidence that felt foreign to her waking self. When morning came, Eleanor dressed for work with unusual care, choosing her grandmother's locket over the cheap jewelry she usually wore. As she walked through the familiar streets toward La Mesa Local, everything looked the same, but felt different, as if she were seeing her world through new eyes. The address on Calle de la Luz pulled at her thoughts like a magnet, and she found herself taking a detour that would lead her past the old church Isabella had mentioned. The building was smaller than she had expected, tucked between a pharmacy and a shop selling religious artifacts, but something about it made her pause. She stood on the sidewalk opposite, studying the weathered stone facade, when a man emerged from the shadows beside the entrance. He was tall and lean, with silver-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to hold centuries of secrets. When their gazes met across the busy street, Eleanor felt the same recognition that had seized her the night before, that sense of coming home to a place she had never been. Eleanor's feet moved without conscious direction, carrying her across the street through gaps in the morning traffic. The man remained perfectly still, watching her approach with an expression that seemed to catalog every detail of her face, her posture, the way she unconsciously touched the locket at her throat. When she reached the sidewalk in front of the church, he stepped forward with the fluid grace she had noticed in Isabella, moving like someone accustomed to commanding attention without effort. "You came sooner than I expected," he said, his voice carrying that same ancient accent she had heard beneath Isabella's words. "My daughter said you might need time to process what happened last night." Eleanor's mouth went dry. "Your daughter? Isabella?" He extended his hand in a gesture that seemed more ceremonial than casual. "I am William Drakon, and you, dear child, are the reason we have been searching for decades." The words hit her like cold water. Eleanor took an instinctive step backward, her rational mind screaming warnings even as something deeper urged her to stay. "I don't understand. I'm nobody special. I'm just a waitress." William's expression softened, and for a moment, Eleanor glimpsed something paternal in his pale eyes. "Your grandmother told you nothing of your heritage." "My grandmother died 5 years ago. She worked in a textile factory her whole life. She never mentioned anyone named Drakon." But even as Eleanor spoke, she remembered the photograph hidden in the locket, the way her grandmother sometimes hummed songs in languages Eleanor had never heard, the dreams that felt more like memories of places that couldn't exist. "Grace was protecting you," William said quietly. "She made choices that cost her everything she had known, but she believed they were necessary to keep you safe. Perhaps she was right. Or perhaps the time for hiding is finally over." Eleanor's hand moved instinctively to her locket. "The photograph I found last night. You were there with her." William nodded slowly. 1952. She was 19, full of fire and conviction. She believed she could bridge worlds that had been separate for centuries. His eyes grew distant. "She was right about that too, though not in the way any of us expected." "Bridge what worlds?" Eleanor's voice came out smaller than she intended. She was asking questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered, but the words kept coming anyway. "Come inside," William said, gesturing toward a side entrance of the church. "There are things you need to understand about what you are, about what your grandmother sacrificed to give you the choice she never had." The door opened onto a narrow corridor that led not into the church proper, but down a stone staircase that seemed far older than the building above. Eleanor's skin prickled as they descended, the air growing cooler and carrying scents that reminded her of her dreams, roses and candle wax, and something metallic that made her pulse quicken. Emergency lighting cast long shadows on the walls, but she could make out intricate stonework that belonged to a different century entirely. "The church is merely the entrance," William explained as they walked. "What lies beneath has been here much longer, a sanctuary for those who needed to exist between worlds." They emerged into a vast underground chamber that took Eleanor's breath away. Vaulted ceilings stretched high above them, supported by columns carved with symbols that seemed to shift in the flickering light of actual torches. Tapestries hung from the walls, depicting scenes that looked like medieval artwork, but the figures in them moved with a lifelike quality that made Eleanor's eyes water when she tried to focus. "Welcome to the Shadow Estate," William said. "Your grandmother's true home, and yours by right of birth." Eleanor turned in a slow circle, taking in the impossible grandeur around her. This couldn't be real. Underground chambers like this didn't exist beneath Mexico City churches. The rational part of her mind insisted she was dreaming, but her body recognized this place with a certainty that made her legs weak. "I don't belong here," she whispered, but the words felt false, even as she spoke them. "You belong here more than anywhere else in either world," a new voice said, and Eleanor turned to see Isabella approaching from an archway she hadn't noticed before. She looked different in this setting, more regal, her modern clothes replaced by flowing fabric that seemed to catch and hold the torchlight. The question is whether you're ready to accept what that means. Eleanor's throat tightened. What I am? What are you talking about? What are you people? Isabella and William exchanged a look that carried decades of shared understanding. When William spoke, his voice held the weight of confession. We are vampires, Eleanor. Ancient guardians of a pact that has kept peace between our kind and humanity for centuries. And you, he paused, studying her face. You are the lost heir of House Rivera, one of the founding bloodlines of our covenant. The words should have sent Eleanor running, should have triggered every horror movie she had ever seen, every nightmare about creatures of the night. Instead, they settled into her consciousness like puzzle pieces finally finding their places. The dreams made sense now. The recognition she had felt meeting Isabella's eyes, the way her body had responded to their presence with familiarity rather than fear. That's impossible, she said, but her hand was already moving to her locket, remembering her grandmother's secret photograph, the surname Rivera, written in careful script. Your grandmother was the youngest daughter of Lord Alejandro Rivera, William continued. When she chose to leave our world and live among humans, she broke a bloodline that had endured for 800 years. We thought House Rivera had ended with her decision. We were wrong. Eleanor sank into a chair she hadn't noticed approaching, her legs finally giving way. If you're vampires, then I'm... She couldn't finish the sentence. You carry the bloodline, Isabella said gently, but you haven't been awakened. Your grandmother made sure of that. She wanted you to have the choice she never felt she had. What choice? William moved closer, and Eleanor noticed his skin held a luminescence that seemed to come from within. A subtle glow that she now realized she had been seeing all along without understanding what it meant. To remain human and live the life your grandmother built for you, or to accept your heritage and help us heal wounds that have been bleeding for decades. Wounds? Isabella sat across from her, leaning forward with an intensity that made Eleanor's skin tingle. When your grandmother left, she took with her the hope of reuniting the scattered members of House Rivera. Over the years, many vampires have chosen exile rather than remain bound by our ancient laws. They call themselves the Wanderers now, living on the margins between our world and yours, belonging fully to neither. They're dying, William added quietly. Without the connection to their bloodlines, without the structure of the covenant, they're losing themselves. Some have forgotten who they were entirely. Others cling to fragments of memory that drive them to desperation. Eleanor's head spun with the implications. And you think I can help them? I think you're the only one who can, Isabella said. House Rivera was always the bridge between worlds, the bloodline that understood humanity because they chose to live among humans. Your grandmother proved it was possible. You could prove it again? But I don't know how to be a vampire. I don't know anything about your world. The knowledge is in your blood, William said. It always has been? What you felt when you met Isabella, the words that came to you in the ancient tongue, that was your heritage awakening. The question is whether you're willing to let it bloom fully. Eleanor thought of her tiny apartment, her struggling existence as a waitress, the constant worry about rent and groceries. Then she thought of the dreams that had haunted her since childhood, visions of belonging somewhere grand and purposeful. What would it mean to accept this? It would mean joining us for the blood moon ceremony in 3 nights, Isabella explained. An ancient ritual that awakens the full power of vampire bloodlines. You would gain abilities you can barely imagine, but you would also accept responsibilities that last lifetimes. And if I say no? William's expression grew sad. Then you go back to your life, and we respect your grandmother's wish that you remain human. But the Wanderers continue to fade, and eventually, the balance between our worlds may collapse entirely. The weight of it pressed down on Eleanor's shoulders like a physical force. She thought of her grandmother, working in the textile factory, living in poverty, sacrificing everything for reasons Eleanor had never understood. Had Grace known this day would come? Had she prepared Eleanor for this choice without ever speaking it aloud? "I need time to think," Eleanor said finally. Isabella nodded. "Of course. But while you think, perhaps you should see what you would be choosing to save." She stood and gestured toward another archway. Eleanor followed on unsteady legs, William silent beside them as they walked through corridors lined with portraits of figures in period dress, their eyes seeming to track their movement through the hallways. They emerged onto a balcony that overlooked a vast underground plaza. Below them, dozens of figures moved through the space, but something was wrong with the scene. The people walked without purpose, their clothes disheveled, their movements erratic. Some sat alone in corners, staring at nothing. Others paced in endless circles, their faces blank with confusion. "The wanderers," Isabella said softly. "Those who chose exile over submission to our laws, but who lack the anchor of bloodline connection to maintain their identity." Eleanor watched a woman who might have been her own age stumble past, her once elegant dress now torn and stained. The woman's eyes held no recognition, no spark of the intelligence that should illuminate a vampire's gaze. How long have they been like this? Some for decades. Others are more recent additions, vampires who thought they could exist independent of the Covenant. William's voice carried deep sadness. "They come here because it's the only place they feel any connection to what they once were, but we can't help them. Our laws forbid forced awakening, and they no longer remember enough to choose it themselves." Eleanor gripped the stone railing. "And you think I could reach them?" "House Rivera always had the gift of connection," Isabella explained. "Your bloodline doesn't just bridge humans and vampires, it bridges all the lost spaces in between. If anyone could remind them of who they were, could offer them a path back to themselves, it would be you." A child wanderer, no more than 10 years old, sat alone near the center of the plaza, rocking back and forth while humming a tune Eleanor somehow recognized. The sight broke something open in her chest, a flood of empathy that felt too large for her human heart to contain. She can't be more than a child. "She's been 10 years old for 3 centuries, William said quietly. "Her family brought her into our world too young, before she had developed the strength to maintain her identity without constant support. When they were killed in the purges of the 1700s, she became lost." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. The child's tune was one her grandmother used to hum while cooking, a melody Eleanor had always assumed was just a folk song. Now she understood it was something older, something that connected her to a heritage that spanned centuries of love and loss. "I can't make this decision standing here," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. "I need to go home. Think about what this means." Isabella reached out and touched her shoulder, the contact sending warmth through Eleanor's entire body. "Take this." She pressed a small silver pendant into Eleanor's palm, its surface carved with the same symbols Eleanor had seen throughout the Shadow Estate. "If you decide to accept the awakening, hold it and speak your true name. We'll know." Eleanor closed her fingers around the pendant, feeling its weight like a promise. "My true name? The one written in your blood, not on your identification papers. When you're ready, you'll know it." William's smile held centuries of patience. "Your grandmother took 5 years to make her choice. You may find yours comes more quickly." They walked back through the corridors in contemplative silence, Eleanor's mind reeling with everything she had seen and learned. When they reached the entrance, William paused. "One more thing," he said, producing an envelope from his jacket. "Your grandmother left this for you, to be given when you came of age in our world. She always believed you would find your way here eventually." Eleanor took the envelope with trembling hands, recognizing her grandmother's careful handwriting on the front. For my Eleanor, when she chooses her path. The walk home passed in a blur of city sounds and afternoon sunlight, but Eleanor felt as if she moved through a different world than the one she had known that morning. The pendant in her pocket seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, and she found herself noticing things she had never seen before. The way shadows fell differently around certain buildings, the subtle luminescence in some stranger's eyes, the ancient symbols carved into stonework she had passed 1,000 times without recognition. In her tiny apartment, Eleanor sat on her bed and opened her grandmother's letter with careful fingers. The paper was old but well preserved, covered in the same careful script she remembered from grocery lists and birthday cards. My dearest Eleanor, it began, if you are reading this, then the choice I hope to spare you has finally arrived. I left the vampire world because I believed love could exist without the weight of ancient obligations, but I never forgot what I gave up to find it. Your grandfather was human, kind and simple and everything I thought I needed. But you, mi niña, you carry both worlds in your blood. I see it in the way you dream of places you've never been, in the languages that come to your tongue without learning, in your capacity to heal hearts that others have given up on. You are what I could never be, a true bridge between worlds. The choice is yours, as it should always have been. But know that whatever you decide, I am proud of the woman you have become. If you choose the awakening, remember that power without compassion is merely destruction. If you choose the human path, remember that extraordinary lives can be lived in ordinary circumstances. Either way, you are loved beyond measure, in this world and any other. Your abuela, Grace Rivera. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, each word settling deeper into her understanding. Her grandmother had known this day would come, had prepared her for it in ways Eleanor was only beginning to comprehend. The dreams, the stories told as bedtime tales, the way Grace had always insisted Eleanor was destined for something special, all of it had been preparation for this moment. That night, Eleanor couldn't bring herself to go to work. She called in sick and spent the hours walking through Mexico City's oldest neighborhoods, seeing them with new eyes. The colonial buildings seemed to whisper histories she was only beginning to understand. The ancient churches held shadows that moved with purpose. The very stones beneath her feet hummed with the energy of centuries. She found herself drawn back to Calle de la Luz as darkness fell, standing across from the small church that hid such impossible wonders. The pendant in her pocket grew warm against her fingers, and she realized she was no longer thinking about whether to accept the awakening, but about what she would do with the power once it was hers. The image of the lost child vampire haunted her thoughts, along with all the other wanderers who had forgotten their own names. If she had the ability to help them remember, to offer them a path back to themselves, could she really choose the safety of her human life instead? Eleanor pulled out her phone and typed a message to her supervisor, requesting 3 days off for a family emergency. It wasn't entirely a lie. Then she walked back to her apartment and began gathering the few things that truly mattered to her. Her grandmother's photographs, some clothing, the locket that had started this entire journey. She would need to be strong for what was coming. The blood moon ceremony would change her irrevocably. But as she thought about the wanderers below the shadow estate, about the possibility of healing ancient wounds and building bridges between worlds, Eleanor realized she had already made her choice. Her grandmother had given her the freedom to choose her own path, but some paths were written in the blood itself. The next morning, Eleanor returned to the shadow estate, the pendant warm in her palm and her grandmother's letter tucked close to her heart. She found Isabella waiting in the underground chambers, as if she had known Eleanor would return. "I want to help them," Eleanor said without preamble. "The wanderers, the child, all of them." Isabella's smile lit up the shadowed space around them. Then, We begin your preparation immediately. The blood moon rises tomorrow night, and there is much you need to learn before then. The training that followed pushed Eleanor beyond every limit she thought she possessed. Isabella taught her to access memories that weren't her own, ancestral knowledge that flowed through the Rivera bloodline like a river of accumulated wisdom. William showed her how to recognize the signs of vampiric deterioration, the subtle ways the Wanderers had lost connection to their true selves. But the most difficult lesson came from within, learning to trust the power that had always lived in her blood, the instinctive understanding of how to heal not just physical wounds, but the deeper injuries of the spirit. Eleanor discovered she could sense the fractures in a person's sense of self, could feel the places where memory and identity had come apart. Your gift is rarer than you know, William explained as they walked through the Wanderer Plaza, Eleanor practicing the subtle art of reading their conditions without interfering. Most vampires can compel or influence, but few can heal the kind of damage that comes from losing oneself entirely. Eleanor paused beside an elderly vampire who sat staring at empty air, his lips moving in silent conversation with phantoms only he could see. Without conscious thought, she reached out and touched his hand. For just a moment, his eyes cleared, focusing on her face with startled recognition. "Maria," he whispered, hope breaking his voice. "You came back." The moment passed quickly, his eyes clouding over again as he returned to his internal world. But Eleanor had felt it, the spark of his true self, buried but not extinguished. The connection had been brief but real, proof that healing was possible. "Who is Maria?" she asked Isabella as they moved on. "His daughter, lost in the Spanish Civil War. He's been looking for her for 80 years. Isabella's voice held deep compassion. "You gave him a moment of peace, perhaps the first he's known in decades." That evening, as Eleanor prepared for the blood moon ceremony that would awaken her fully into vampire society, she sat with her grandmother's letter one final time. The words took on new meaning now, weighted with everything she had learned about the choice Grace had made and the responsibilities Eleanor was about to accept. She thought about the life she was leaving behind, the simple routine of La Mesa Locale, the struggle to make rent, the comfortable anonymity of being nobody special. Then she thought about the Wanderers, about the child who had been 10 years old for 3 centuries, about the old man searching for his lost daughter. Choice, Eleanor realized, was sometimes less about selecting between options and more about recognizing the path that had been calling to you all along. Her grandmother had chosen love over duty, humanity over power, but she had always known that Eleanor might choose differently. That was the gift Grace had given her. Not just the freedom to choose, but the understanding that both choices carried their own forms of courage. As the city lights blurred outside her window, Hope knew she was no longer just a waitress, but a bridge, carrying the weight and the wonder of 2 worlds. Eleanor stood before the ancient altar as the blood moon reached its zenith, its crimson light streaming through crystalline formations embedded in the chamber's ceiling. The gathered vampires formed a circle around her, their faces solemn with the weight of ceremony, but she felt no fear. The pendant at her throat pulsed with warmth, and her grandmother's locket rested over her heart, both talismans connecting her to a legacy she was finally ready to claim. William approached, carrying a chalice that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. "Eleanor Rivera," he said, his voice echoing through the vast space. "Do you accept the awakening of your blood, the responsibilities of your house, and the covenant that binds our worlds together?" Eleanor's voice came clear and strong. "I do." The ritual liquid burned as it touched her lips, but the fire that spread through her veins felt like coming alive after years of merely existing. Power unfurled in her chest like wings she had never known she possessed, and with it came the accumulated memories of 8 centuries of Rivera ancestors. She saw her bloodline's history in flashes. Vampires who had chosen to live among humans, who had served as mediators and healers, who had built bridges across the chasm of fear that separated the species. When the transformation completed, Eleanor opened her eyes to find the world painted in extraordinary detail. Every face in the circle glowed with inner light. Every whispered breath carried its own music. Every heartbeat in the chamber drummed in perfect harmony with her own. But more than that, she could feel the wanderers below, their fractured souls calling to her like lost children in the dark. "Your awakening is complete," William said, pride evident in his ancient eyes, "but your true test begins now." Isabella led her to the balcony overlooking the Wanderer Plaza, where the lost vampires continued their aimless wandering. But now Eleanor could see what she had missed before. Threads of light connecting each of them to memories they had forgotten, to identities that still existed but had been buried under decades of confusion and despair. "I can see them," Eleanor whispered, wonder coloring her voice. "Their true selves. They're still there." Without hesitation, she descended into the plaza. The gathered vampires followed at a respectful distance as Eleanor approached the first wanderer, the elderly man who had briefly recognized her touch. This time, when she placed her hands on his shoulders, the connection blazed to life with the full force of her awakened power. "Roberto Mendez," she said, speaking his true name as she read it in, the light that surrounded him. "Soldier, father, beloved of Maria Esperanza Cortés, you have been searching for her, but she found peace long ago. She wants you to find peace too." The old vampire's eyes cleared completely, decades of confusion melting away as he remembered himself. Tears streamed down his weathered cheeks as he looked at Eleanor with profound gratitude. "I remember," he whispered. "I remember who I am." One by one, Eleanor moved through the plaza, her hands glowing with healing light as she touched each wanderer and spoke their forgotten names. Some remembered immediately, their identities snapping back into focus like scattered pieces of a puzzle finally assembled. Others required more time, gentle coaxing as she helped them navigate through layers of lost years to find themselves again. The child vampire was the most challenging. 3 centuries of being lost had created barriers that even Eleanor's power struggled to penetrate. But when Eleanor knelt beside her and began humming the same tune her grandmother had sung, the same melody the child had been repeating endlessly, something fundamental shifted. "Ana Luz Velasco," Eleanor whispered, cradling the child's face in her glowing hands. "Daughter of the Night Court, beloved of Luna and Esteban, you are not alone anymore." The child's eyes focused for the first time in centuries, and when she smiled, it was like watching the sun rise after an endless night. "I remember my papa's stories," she said in a voice clear as crystal bells. "He told me about the moon singing to the stars." Around the plaza, the healed wanderers stood in wonder, seeing their sanctuary with clear eyes for the first time in decades. Their clothes straightened, their postures regained dignity, their faces shone with the inner light that marked them as whole. What had been a collection of lost souls became a community of vampires ready to rejoin the world they had left behind. William approached Eleanor as she helped the last wanderer remember his name. "What you have done here tonight will echo through our history for centuries," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "House Rivera has returned not just in name, but in purpose." Eleanor looked around at the transformed plaza, at vampires embracing each other and sharing stories of who they had been before they became lost, and felt a deep satisfaction settle in her bones. This was what she had been meant for, what her bloodline had always been destined to accomplish. "There are others," she said, already sensing the threads of connection that stretched beyond the Shadow Estate. "Wanderers in other cities, other countries. They're calling to me." Isabella stepped forward, her expression bright with possibility. "The Covenant has contacts across the globe. Vampire houses that have been struggling with their own lost members for decades. They would welcome your help. Eleanor nodded, feeling the weight and wonder of her new responsibility. But as she contemplated the magnitude of what lay ahead, another pull tugged at her consciousness. Above them, beyond the stone and shadow of the underground sanctuary, Mexico City continued its nightly rhythm. Her old life waited there, simple and human and precious in its ordinary struggles. "I need to see Señor Martinez," Eleanor said suddenly. "I need to talk to him." The request surprised the assembled vampires, but William nodded understanding. "The bridge must be anchored on both sides," he agreed. "Go. We will be here when you return." Eleanor made her way through the familiar streets as dawn approached, her enhanced senses cataloging every detail of the city she had known but never truly seen. At La Mesa Locale, she found her old boss preparing for the morning shift, his face creased with worry that transformed to relief when he saw her. "Eleanor, where have you been? You disappeared 3 days ago, and I was starting to think something terrible had happened." She studied his kind, weathered face and made a decision that felt as momentous as accepting the blood moon ceremony. "Señor Martinez, I need to tell you something important about who I really am." Over coffee in the empty restaurant, Eleanor explained everything. She told him about the vampires, about her awakened heritage, about the wanderers she had healed, and the global mission that lay ahead of her. She expected disbelief, fear, perhaps even revulsion. Instead, Señor Martinez listened with the careful attention of a man who had lived long enough to know that the world held more mysteries than most people were willing to acknowledge. "Your grandmother," he said finally. "She was special too, wasn't she? I always wondered why she seemed to know things about people that she shouldn't have known." Eleanor nodded, tears pricking her eyes at the memory of Grace's gentle wisdom. Señor Martinez reached across the table and patted her hand. "Then you do what you need to do, mija. But remember that you'll always have a home here, whenever you need to remember what it feels like to be human." "I want to keep working here," Eleanor said, the words surprising even herself. "Not every day, not like before. But I want to maintain this connection. The bridge has to exist on both sides." His smile lit up his entire face. "We'll make it work. Part-time, flexible schedule. The customers always liked you best anyway." Eleanor spent the rest of the morning serving breakfast to the early crowd, her enhanced abilities allowing her to anticipate needs before customers even realized they had them. She poured coffee with perfect timing, remembered preferences without being asked, and somehow made everyone who entered feel a little more welcome than usual. The ordinary magic of human kindness took on new dimensions when filtered through vampire perception. When Isabella found her there at noon, Eleanor was wiping down tables with the same careful attention she had always shown, but now her movements carried an unconscious grace that spoke of her transformed nature. "The Eastern clans have sent word," Isabella said quietly, sliding into a corner booth. "They've heard about what happened with the Wanderers. They're requesting your assistance with their own lost members." Eleanor set down her cleaning cloth and joined Isabella at the table. "When do we leave?" "Whenever you're ready." "But Eleanor," Isabella's expression grew serious, "what you've chosen to do, maintaining connections to both worlds, it's never been attempted before. The challenges will be immense." Eleanor looked around the humble restaurant where she had discovered her true calling, then back at Isabella, whose own journey had been shaped by bridging different aspects of vampire society. "My grandmother lived between worlds her entire life. She taught me that strength comes not from choosing one side, but from refusing to let either side be forgotten." Over the following weeks, Eleanor established a rhythm that defied conventional understanding. She spent her mornings at La Mesa Locale, her presence there serving as an anchor to humanity that kept her grounded even as her power grew. Her afternoons belonged to the Shadow Estate, where she worked with newly healed wanderers to help them integrate back into vampire society. Her evenings were devoted to study, learning the intricate histories and customs of vampire houses across the globe. The transformation in the Shadow Estate was remarkable. Where once the Wanderer Plaza had been filled with lost souls, it now bustled with purposeful activity. Former wanderers worked alongside traditional vampires, their unique perspectives bridging gaps that had existed for centuries. Roberto Mendez became a counselor for other vampires struggling with loss. Ana Luz, still appearing as a child but with centuries of wisdom, served as a mediator in disputes where her innocence allowed her to see solutions others missed. Eleanor's reputation spread through vampire networks worldwide. Letters arrived daily requesting her assistance, each one representing dozens of lost vampires who might be saved from their endless wandering. The magnitude of the need was overwhelming, but Eleanor found strength in the knowledge that every person she helped became a bridge themselves, carrying healing back to their own communities. The morning she received the formal invitation from the Eastern clans, Eleanor was serving coffee to a regular customer who had been coming to La Mesa Locale for 15 years. The man always ordered the same thing and always left the exact same tip. But today he looked up at her with eyes that held new awareness. "You seem different, Eleanor," he said thoughtfully. "Happier. More present." She smiled, feeling the truth of his observation. "I found out who I'm supposed to be." "Good for you, mija. We should all be so lucky." After he left, Eleanor opened the elegant envelope that had arrived with that morning's mail. The invitation was written in gold ink on paper that seemed to shimmer with its own light, requesting her presence at the Autumn Council where representatives from vampire houses across 3 continents would gather to discuss the future of their species. Isabella appeared at her elbow, having approached with the silent grace Eleanor was learning to associate with fully awakened vampires. "They want to make your work official," she explained. "Create a new position within the covenant structure, Bridge Walker, with authority to travel freely between all vampire territories and work with lost members regardless of their original house affiliation." Eleanor set the invitation on the counter and looked around the restaurant that had been her entire world just weeks before. Now it represented something different, a choice to remain connected to humanity even as she embraced her supernatural heritage. The customers chatted over their meals, completely unaware that they were being served by someone who could heal centuries-old wounds and speak with the authority of an ancient bloodline. "I accept," she said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had replaced her old timidity. "But I have conditions." Isabella raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "I keep working here, not just as a cover or a hobby, but as a real commitment. This place, these people, they're part of who I am now. Any position they offer me has to accommodate that." They might not understand the importance of maintaining human connections. Eleanor smiled, thinking of her grandmother's letter, of the choices Grace had made, and the legacy she had left behind. "Then I'll teach them." That's what bridges do, after all. They help people understand that there's always something valuable on the other side. That afternoon, Eleanor stood before the assembled vampires of the Shadow Estate, her transformation from timid waitress to confident leader visible in every aspect of her bearing. The healed wanderers formed the front row of her audience, their faces glowing with gratitude and renewed purpose. Behind them sat the ancient vampires who had witnessed her awakening, their expressions filled with respect for what she had accomplished in such a short time. "You have given me a gift beyond measure," Eleanor began, her voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. "You awakened not just my power, but my understanding of who I was meant to be. Now I want to offer that same gift to every lost vampire in the world, every wanderer who has forgotten their true name." She paused, her gaze finding William in the crowd. "But I also want to offer something else. Proof that we don't have to choose between our nature and our compassion, between power and humanity. The bridge my grandmother built when she chose love over duty doesn't have to be burned. It can be strengthened, expanded, used to heal wounds on both sides. The applause that followed was unlike anything Eleanor had ever heard, the sound of ancient beings recognizing a truth they had forgotten. As the assembly dispersed, vampires approached her one by one, sharing their own stories of division and loss, expressing their hope that her work might heal their communities as it had healed the Shadow Estate. William was the last to approach her, his expression carrying the weight of centuries, but also something Eleanor had rarely seen in him: genuine joy. "Your grandmother would be proud beyond words," he said simply. "You've become everything she dreamed you could be, and more than any of us dared to hope." Eleanor touched the locket at her throat, feeling Grace's presence in the warm metal. "She gave me the foundation, you gave me the tools, but the choice to build something new, that was mine." "And what will you build?" William asked. Eleanor looked around the transformed chamber, at the evidence of healing and hope that surrounded them, then thought of the invitation upstairs and the global mission that awaited her. But she also thought of La Mesa Locale, of Señor Martinez's kind understanding, of the customers who had no idea they were part of something larger than themselves. "A world where being lost doesn't mean being forgotten," she said finally. "Where bridges exist not just between species, but between all the different ways of being whole." 3 months later, Eleanor Rivera stood on the steps of the ancient monastery in Tibet where the Autumn Council was convening, her official credentials as bridge walker tucked into the same simple purse she had carried as a waitress. The mountain air was thin and cold, but her vampire constitution made the altitude irrelevant. What took her breath away was the sight of vampires from dozens of different houses and traditions, all gathered to discuss the future of their species. She had traveled extensively in the weeks leading up to the council, her work taking her from the underground courts of Prague to the desert sanctuaries of Morocco. Everywhere she went, she found wanderers who had given up hope of ever remembering themselves, and everywhere she went, she proved them wrong. Her reputation had grown beyond anything she could have imagined, but more importantly, her understanding of her own purpose had deepened. The monastery hall where the council convened was ancient beyond measure, its walls covered with tapestries that depicted the history of vampire civilization. Eleanor took her place among representatives whose bloodlines stretched back millennia, feeling not intimidated but grateful for the opportunity to add her own thread to the tapestry. When called upon to present her formal proposal, Eleanor rose with the quiet confidence that had become her trademark. "Honored elders and fellow servants of the covenant," she began, "I stand before you not as a product of ancient tradition, but as proof that tradition can evolve without losing its strength." She spoke of her work with the Wanderers, of the healing that was possible when bridges were built instead of walls. She presented statistics on the number of lost vampires who had been restored to their communities, on the strengthened relationships between previously fractured houses, on the new understanding that was emerging between vampire and human societies. But more than facts and figures, she offered them vision. "We stand at a crossroads," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast hall. "We can continue as we have, maintaining separation between our world and theirs, allowing our lost members to fade into nothing. Or we can choose to be bridges ourselves, to heal the wounds that have festered in darkness for too long." The debate that followed was intense and sometimes heated, centuries of tradition clashing with the possibility of change. But throughout it all, Eleanor remained steady, drawing on the lessons her grandmother had taught her about the power of gentle persistence and the strength that came from knowing exactly who you were meant to be. When the final vote was called, the result was unanimous. The covenant would officially recognize the position of bridge walker, with Eleanor Rivera as its first occupant. More than that, they would establish a network of healing sanctuaries modeled on the transformed Shadow Estate, each one staffed by vampires trained in Eleanor's methods of restoration and integration. As Eleanor accepted the formal appointment, she thought of the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a timid waitress who could barely make rent to a leader whose influence would shape vampire society for generations to come, the transformation seemed impossible. But looking back, she could see that every step had been necessary. Every choice had led her closer to the person she was meant to become. The celebration that followed the formal ceremony was unlike anything in vampire history. Representatives from ancient houses mingling freely with former wanderers who had found their way back to themselves. Eleanor moved through the crowd, no longer the uncertain young woman who had dropped a coffee cup in a Mexico City restaurant, but still carrying the compassion and humility that had made her transformation possible. Near midnight, as the mountain stars blazed overhead, Eleanor found herself alone on the monastery's highest balcony. The world spread out below her, vast and full of possibility, dotted with cities where lost vampires waited for someone to help them remember their names. The magnitude of the work ahead might have overwhelmed her once, but now it filled her with purpose. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Señor Martinez. Saw the news about your appointment. The morning regulars are asking when you'll be back to work. I told them you'd always be our Eleanor, no matter how important you become. She smiled, typing back, "Home next week. Save me the morning shift." Because that was the truth she had learned through all of her transformation. Growth didn't require abandoning who you had been. It required integrating all the pieces of yourself into something larger and more complete. She was Eleanor Rivera, heir to an ancient vampire house and bridgewalker for the Global Covenant. She was also Eleanor the waitress, who made perfect coffee and remembered how everyone liked their eggs. Both identities were real, both were necessary, and both would travel with her as she embarked on the next phase of her journey. Tomorrow she would begin planning her first official mission to the Australian territories, where reports suggested an entire generation of wanderers had been lost to the gold rush chaos of the 1850s. It would be challenging work, requiring months of careful restoration and integration. But tonight, she was simply Eleanor, standing under starlight and feeling the weight of two worlds balanced perfectly on her shoulders. Her grandmother's locket rested warm against her heart, and in her pocket, the pendant Isabella had given her pulsed with gentle light, both talismans connecting her to the love and purpose that had made her transformation possible. The bridge between worlds wasn't just a metaphor anymore, it was her life, her calling, her gift to a universe that needed healing more than it needed separation. And as Eleanor looked out over the vast expanse of night, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would meet them with the same courage her grandmother had shown, the same compassion that had guided her awakening, and the same certainty that bridges were always stronger than walls. In the distance, dawn was beginning to touch the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of possibility. Eleanor Rivera, bridge walker and healer of ancient wounds, smiled and began planning her journey home.